The morning sun barely peeked through the clouds as Captain James Harrington strode through the airport terminal. His rolling suitcase clicked rhythmically against the tile floor, matching the confident pace of a man who'd been flying commercial jets for over 20 years. At 53, with salt and pepper hair and a posture that commanded respect, he considered himself one of the best pilots at Atlantic Airlines, and most people didn't dare suggest otherwise. James checked his watch, 5:40 a.m., right on schedule as always. Flight 2187 from Chicago to Atlanta would be boarding in an hour and 20 minutes. His routine never varied: arrive early, get coffee, review weather patterns, and meet his co-pilot Dave for their usual pre-flight banter. Today's flight was full minus 243 passengers who'd placed their lives in his capable hands without a second thought, just how he liked it. "Morning, Captain," called the security guard at crew check-in, tipping his hat with familiar respect. "Morning, Pete. How's that grandson of yours doing in college?" Dean's list again. "Can't believe he's studying to be a pilot too. Maybe you'll fly with him someday." James laughed. "Well, tell him to hurry up. I've only got about 10 years left before retirement." The conversation warmed him as he made his way to the crew lounge, coffee in hand, flight plans tucked under his arm. But when he pushed open the cockpit door 15 minutes later, his day took an unexpected turn. Instead of Dave's familiar face and booming laugh, he found a young black woman in the co-pilot's seat, methodically working through the pre-flight checklist with quick, confident movements. She looked up as the door opened, her expression professional but friendly. "Good morning, Captain Harrington. I'm First Officer Amara Washington," she said, extending her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." James hesitated just long enough before shaking her hand that Amara noticed. Her smile didn't waver, but something shifted in her eyes, a look she'd worn many times before. "Where's Dave?" James asked, not bothering to hide his surprise as he settled into his seat, avoiding her gaze while arranging his materials. "Food poisoning, apparently. I was assigned as his replacement. I just transferred from the West Coast Division last week," Amara explained, returning to her checklist without missing a beat. "I've done this Chicago-Atlanta route 6 times before, though with different captains." James grunted in acknowledgement, studying her from the corner of his eye. She looked young, too young in his opinion to have much real experience. She wore her hair in a neat, professional bun beneath her cap, her uniform crisp and perfectly regulation. Something about her calm confidence irritated him. "How long have you been with Atlantic?" he asked, his tone making it clear he expected the answer to be not long. 7 years with Atlantic, plus 5 years Air Force before that, she replied without looking up. "I've logged over 5,000 flight hours, including 3,200 on this aircraft type." The answer caught James off guard. That was an impressive record for any pilot her age. Still, he'd flown with female pilots before, though admittedly few black women. And in his mind, they always had something to prove. He'd be keeping a close eye on this one. As they continued preparations, the usual easy rhythm James felt in the cockpit was missing. He double-checked her work when he thought she wasn't looking. When she mentioned something about a new procedure Atlantic had implemented, he dismissed it with, "That's not how we do things on my flights." Amara simply nodded and continued working, her face revealing nothing. But her mind was cataloging every interaction, every dismissal. She'd faced this before and had developed her own system for handling it: stay professional, demonstrate competence without showing off, and most importantly, be prepared for anything. Neither of them could have guessed just how critical that preparation would prove to be in just a few hours' time. The cockpit of the Boeing 737 felt unusually small that morning. As Captain Harrington settled into his seat, he made a show of adjusting everything: the seat height, the rudder pedals, the air vents, all while barely acknowledging Amara's presence beside him. The morning sun streamed through the windshield, highlighting the tension hanging in the air between them. "I'll need to review your work," Harrington said, reaching for the checklist Amara had already completed. His tone suggested this was a special exception, not his standard procedure. "Of course, Captain," Amara replied evenly, handing over her meticulous notes. 6 years of flight school, 5 years in the Air Force flying transport planes through combat zones, and 7 years at commercial airlines had taught her to keep her cool in far worse situations than this. Harrington flipped through the pages with exaggerated care, his eyebrows rising occasionally, as if surprised to find everything in order. "You missed the auxiliary power unit check," he finally said, pointing to a line on the form. Amara leaned over slightly. "It's actually on page 2, sir. I completed it at 5:50. Harrington's jaw tightened as he flipped the page and saw she was right. He cleared his throat and continued scanning, determined to find something out of place. "Let's go through the weather briefing again," he said, pulling up the radar on his screen. "These summer storms can change quickly. You familiar with flying through the kind of turbulence we get around the Appalachians?" "Yes, sir. I flew this route last month when those unusual storm cells were developing over Tennessee. We had to divert around some level 5 turbulence areas." Harrington frowned. "Well, today's different. See this formation here?" He pointed to the screen with a slight smirk. "This isn't your standard convection pattern. You sure you understand how to read these instruments correctly?" 3 flight attendants entering the cockpit for their briefing overheard his condescending tone. They exchanged uncomfortable glances. The chief flight attendant, Rosa, had worked with Amara on a Denver route and knew her capabilities well. "Morning, Captain First Officer," Rosa said with pointed emphasis on Amara's title. "We're ready whenever you are." During the crew briefing, Harrington dominated the conversation, interrupting Amara twice when she attempted to add information about passenger needs or weather conditions. When she mentioned the possible need for seatbelt signs during their approach to Atlanta due to expected turbulence, Harrington waved her off. "I'll decide when the seatbelt signs go on," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made even Rosa straighten her back. "I've been flying through Atlanta storms since before smartphones existed." As the briefing concluded and the flight attendants prepared to leave, Rosa caught Amara's eye and gave her a subtle, supportive nod. The small gesture didn't go unnoticed by Amara, who returned it with the faintest smile. Once they were alone again, the real work of preparing for departure began. Amara continued performing her duties with quiet efficiency, double-checking systems and communicating with ground crew. Each time she spoke on the radio, Harrington would add unnecessary clarifications afterward, as if correcting her. "Ground control, this is Atlantic 2187 requesting pushback clearance," Amara said into her headset. "Copy that, Atlantic 2187, stand by for pushback instructions," came the response. Harrington immediately leaned toward his microphone. "Ground, Atlantic 2187, we're fully boarded with all systems checked and ready for immediate pushback when you give the word." The needless addition made Amara press her lips together briefly before relaxing her face back to neutral. She'd seen this behavior before, the need to establish dominance, to remind everyone who was really in charge. In her years of flying, she'd developed a mental catalog of these types. The old-school captains who couldn't accept that aviation was changing, that people who didn't look like them could be equally skilled. What Harrington didn't realize was that his behavior was telling Amara everything she needed to know about how to handle the next few hours. She'd weathered worse storms than the one brewing beside her, and she'd do what she always did, stay professional, focus on the job, and be ready for anything. Because in her experience, it was often the captains with the most to prove who needed the most help when things went wrong. The boarding process was nearly complete as Captain Harrington and First Officer Amara sat in the cockpit finalizing their flight plan. Outside, the morning had turned gray, with clouds gathering on the horizon. Amara studied the weather radar with growing concern. A system that hadn't appeared in the morning briefing was developing along their planned route to Atlanta. "Captain," she said, pointing to the screen, "there's a developing cell here that wasn't in our original weather report. Based on these wind patterns, it could intensify as it moves east." Her finger traced the path on the screen. "If we adjust our route slightly to the west, we might avoid the worst of it." Harrington barely glanced at her screen before returning to his own paperwork. "Those summer storms look worse on radar than they actually are," he said dismissively. "I've seen dozens of these pop up and disappear within the hour." "With respect, sir," Amara persisted, "I've been tracking this particular formation since it appeared 20 minutes ago. The barometric pressure is dropping rapidly in that sector and—" Harrington cut her off mid-sentence, his voice sharp. "I've been flying this route since you were in grade school," he said, loud enough that the flight attendant checking the cockpit door security could hear him clearly. Let's stick to what the official weather report says and stop trying to impress me with unnecessary observations." The flight attendant, Rosa, pretended to be busy with the door, but her eyes flickered between the two pilots. She'd worked with Amara before and had witnessed her skillful navigation through a tricky mountain approach in Colorado during unexpected wind shear. The memory made Rosa uneasy as she listened to Harrington dismiss Amara's concerns. Amara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a deliberate breath and made notes on her tablet. Years of being the only black woman in briefing rooms and cockpits had taught her when to push and when to document. This was definitely a documenting moment. "I've noted my observation in the flight log," she said evenly. "And I've updated our alternate diversion airports, just in case." The last part was standard procedure, but her emphasis was subtle, a professional reminder that preparation for contingencies was part of her job. Harrington's jaw tightened visibly, but before he could respond, the lead ground crew member called through on the intercom to confirm their pushback time. As they completed final preparations, Rosa returned to the cockpit with another flight attendant, Chen, for the final briefing. Chen was new to the airline, fresh-faced and still learning the routines. He looked between the two pilots, sensing the tension but uncertain of its cause. "Cabin is secured for departure, Captain," Rosa reported. "We have 243 passengers, including 3 unaccompanied minors and a passenger in 14C who may need extra assistance during landing due to mobility issues." "Noted," Harrington replied curtly. "We're expecting a smooth flight today, standard approach into Atlanta. About 2 hours and 40 minutes total flight time." Amara glanced at her weather screen again. The cell she'd been concerned about was growing more defined. "We might encounter some light chop about 90 minutes in," she added, looking directly at Rosa. "It could be helpful to plan your service accordingly." Harrington's shoulders stiffened. "As I said, we're expecting a smooth flight. Don't complicate the briefing with speculations." Rosa and Chen exchanged glances, the awkwardness palpable. Rosa had been flying long enough to know when a co-pilot was being steamrolled. "We'll be prepared either way," Rosa said diplomatically, giving Amara a quick, sympathetic look as she turned to leave. After the door closed behind the flight attendants, Harrington turned to Amara, his voice low but hard. "Listen, I don't know how they ran things on the West Coast, but on my flights, there's one captain, and that's me. I make the calls on weather, route adjustments, and passenger announcements. Your job is to support, not to override or undermine." Amara met his gaze steadily. "My job is to ensure the safety of this aircraft and everyone on it. That's what I intend to do." Something in her quiet confidence seemed to irritate Harrington further, but the ground crew's signal for pushback interrupted whatever he'd been about to say. Instead, he reached for the radio to request clearance, effectively ending the conversation. As the engines rumbled to life and they began the taxi toward the runway, Amara continued monitoring her weather display, making private notes that she hoped would prove unnecessary. The storm system was definitely growing. She just hoped Harrington would see it too before they were in the middle of it. The massive jet thundered down the runway, gathering speed until the nose lifted smoothly into the air. Amara completed her takeoff calls with precision, her voice clear and steady through the headset. As the plane climbed through 10,000 feet, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and the familiar rhythm of a routine flight settled over the aircraft. But inside the cockpit, the air felt heavier than the clouds they were passing through. "I'll take the controls," Harrington said, though it was already his leg of the flight. The unnecessary statement was just another small reminder of who was in charge. "You have the controls, Captain," Amara confirmed professionally, following protocol despite the obvious tension. As they leveled off at cruising altitude, Amara noticed the weather system she'd flagged earlier had indeed intensified. The dark mass on the radar was now directly in their flight path, about 40 minutes ahead. She watched Harrington's eyes flick to the same screen, saw the moment of hesitation before he adjusted their heading slightly, not enough to avoid the system entirely, but enough to acknowledge its presence. He didn't verbalize the change, didn't acknowledge that her earlier warning had been correct. Amara said nothing either, simply updated their flight path in the system and made notes of the heading change. The silence between them stretched, filled only by routine radio calls and the hum of the aircraft. Through the cockpit door, they could hear the flight attendants beginning their service, the clatter of the beverage cart moving down the aisle. Occasionally, a passenger would walk past to the forward lavatory, their curious eyes peering into the cockpit window before continuing on. Atlantic 2187, Atlanta Center, the radio crackled with air traffic control's voice. Be advised, we're seeing some weather developing along your route. Expect possible deviations in approximately 30 minutes. Roger that, Atlanta Center, Amara responded automatically. We're monitoring the situation. Harrington shot her a look that clearly said he should have been the one to respond. He reached for his microphone. Atlanta Center, this is Captain Harrington. We've already adjusted course to account for the weather. We'll advise if we need further deviations. The pointed clarification hung in the air between them. Amara kept her expression neutral, but her thoughts were anything but. She'd flown with dozens of captains over her career, some excellent mentors, others merely adequate pilots. 3 other pilots who had worked with her on previous flights had pulled her aside afterward to praise her exceptional situational awareness and calm under pressure. Captain Lai on the San Francisco route had even written a commendation for her file after she'd spotted a potential hydraulic issue before it became critical. None of that seemed to matter to Harrington. Every time she completed a standard checklist or made a routine call, his body language screamed skepticism. He double-checked her fuel calculations, repeated her radio confirmations, and constantly scanned her side of the instrument panel as if expecting to find a mistake. An hour into the flight, Rosa entered the cockpit with coffee and a weather update from the company's dispatch. Dispatch says there's been some unexpected intensification of that storm system, she said, handing them each a cup. They're suggesting a southern deviation for flights on our route. Harrington accepted the coffee with a nod. We've already adjusted, he said curtly. Rosa's eyes flicked to Amara, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent communication between women who'd learned to navigate difficult workplace dynamics. We might need to adjust further, Amara said carefully, pointing to the updated radar. The cell is expanding faster than predicted. I'll make that call when necessary, Harrington replied, his tone final. After Rosa left, the silence returned, heavier than before. Amara continued her usual scans, hyper-aware of each brewing cloud formation visible through the windshield. The smooth ride wouldn't last much longer. She could feel it in the supple vibrations of the aircraft, in the slight changes in air pressure as they approached the weather system. Her hands rested lightly on the controls during her monitoring phase, ready for whatever came next. In the Air Force, she'd flown through worse conditions than this with far less sophisticated equipment. Today, those skills might be needed more than Harrington could possibly imagine. 2 hours into the flight, the smooth journey took a sudden turn. The first jolt caught a flight attendant off guard, sending coffee sloshing over the rim of a cup she was serving. Passengers glanced up from their books and screens, a ripple of unease passing through the cabin as the seatbelt sign chimed on. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Harrington's voice came over the intercom, steady and practiced. We're experiencing some light turbulence as we pass through a weather system. Please return to your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened until we're through this rough patch. In the cockpit, Amara studied the radar with growing concern. What had appeared as a moderate storm cell 30 minutes ago had rapidly intensified, its angry red core now directly in their path. The system had expanded faster than even she had anticipated. We need to deviate further south, she said, pointing to a potential path around the worst of the storm. This cell has developed into a supercell. Those updrafts could be exceeding 100 miles per hour. Harrington frowned at the screen, finally seeing what Amara had warned about hours earlier. Atlanta Center, Atlantic 2187 requesting deviation to heading 180 to avoid weather, he said into his headset, not acknowledging Amara's recommendation but following it nonetheless. Atlantic 2187, deviation approved. Reports indicate severe turbulence in your area. Multiple aircraft are diverting. The plane shuddered again, harder this time. In the cabin, a child started crying. The aircraft dropped suddenly, that sickening elevator fall feeling that makes even experienced travelers grip their armrests. They dropped 200 feet in seconds before stabilizing. Harrington's hands tightened on the controls. "This is more than just turbulence," he muttered, more to himself than to Amara. That's when it happened. A blinding flash lit up the cockpit as lightning struck terrifyingly close to the aircraft. The electronics flickered momentarily. A heartbeat later, warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. The steady hum of the right engine changed pitch, faltering. "Engine 2 is losing power," Amara reported, her voice calm despite the crisis unfolding. She was already running through the engine failure checklist before Harrington could respond. The situation deteriorated rapidly. More warning lights activated. Electrical system distress, communication systems faltering. The plane shuddered violently as they entered the most severe turbulence either pilot had experienced in years. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. Atlanta Center, Atlantic 2187. We have an engine failure and electrical system issues at 37,000 feet," Harrington called, his voice tight with tension. The radio crackled with static. The response from air traffic control was broken, barely intelligible. "Copy, emergency, say intentions." Another flash of lightning, another sickening drop. In the cabin, oxygen masks deployed, dangling above terrified passengers as the plane briefly lost cabin pressure before stabilizing again. The cockpit door opened as Rosa clung to the frame, her face pale. "Captain, we have passengers injured from the turbulence. How much longer in this storm?" Harrington didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the cascade of warning indicators, his mind racing through emergency procedures that suddenly seemed inadequate for the multiple system failures they were experiencing. In thousands of flight hours, he'd had single system failures, practiced emergency procedures in simulators, but this particular combination of engine failure, electrical issues, and extreme weather conditions was something he'd never faced in real life. The plane lurched again, banking steeply to the right as the loss of power from engine 2 created asymmetric thrust. Harrington fought the controls, sweat beading on his forehead. "Rosa, get back to the cabin and prepare for emergency landing," he managed to say, his voice strained with effort. As Rosa disappeared back into the cabin, securing the cockpit door behind her, Harrington turned to Amara with an expression she'd never seen on his face before: uncertainty. "I've never seen a cascade failure like this," he admitted, the cockpit alarms creating a cacophony around them as he struggled to level the aircraft. Amara was already analyzing the warning lights, her mind racing through the possible connections between the systems that were failing. Her military training kicked in, the countless hours in simulators where instructors had delighted in creating impossible scenarios to test pilots' limits. As passengers screamed in the cabin and the plane continued to shudder violently, something clicked in her mind. "I've seen this before," she said, her hands already moving toward the circuit breaker panel. "I've seen this before," Amara said, her voice cutting through the chaos of alarms and the roar of the struggling engine. Without hesitation, she reached for the circuit breaker panel while keeping her other hand steady on the controls. "What are you doing?" Harrington asked, his knuckles white as he fought to keep the plane level. The lightning strike created a power surge that's causing a feedback loop in the electrical system, Amara explained, her fingers moving with practiced precision across the panel. "It's affecting the engine sensors, making the computer think there's a catastrophic failure." Harrington watched in stunned silence as Amara reset specific circuit breakers in a sequence he didn't recognize. This wasn't in the standard manual. This wasn't part of their regular emergency training. "Where did you learn that procedure?" he asked, genuine curiosity breaking through his panic. "Advanced Systems Failure Training at Edwards Air Force Base," she replied without looking up. "And I experienced something similar over Afghanistan when our C-17 took lightning damage during a medical evacuation." The plane continued to shake violently, but after Amara reset the fourth circuit breaker, several warning lights suddenly went dark. The right engine's pitch began to stabilize. "I need you to follow my lead," she said firmly, no longer the deferential co-pilot, but a pilot taking command in a crisis. "I need to reset the main avionics bus, but we'll lose primary instruments for approximately 6 seconds when I do. You need to fly by feel during that time." Harrington swallowed hard and nodded, all his earlier arrogance gone. "I'll follow your lead." "Atlanta Center, Atlantic 2187. Amara called over the radio, which was working intermittently. We have a partial recovery of Engine 2 and are working to stabilize electrical systems. Request immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport. The response was broken but clear enough. Atlantic 2187, Nashville is your nearest suitable option. Recommend heading 090. Turning to heading 090, Amara confirmed, nodding to Harrington, who adjusted their course. The storm still raged around them, lightning flashing through the cockpit windows, but the violent shaking had subsided to more manageable turbulence. On my mark, I'm going to reset the main bus, Amara said, her hand hovering over a protected switch. Keep us level and on heading. Ready? Harrington took a deep breath. Ready. 3, 2, 1, mark. The cockpit went dark. The primary flight displays blanked out, leaving them with only standby instruments and the view outside, which was nothing but dark storm clouds. Harrington gripped the controls, focusing on maintaining the feel of level flight as he'd been taught in his earliest days of flight training before glass cockpits and digital displays. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The plane buffeted in the storm, but Harrington kept it steady, trusting Amara's instructions completely now. 4 seconds, 5 seconds. Come on, Amara whispered to the aircraft, as if coaxing it back to life. 6 seconds. With a series of beeps, the displays flickered back on. More warning lights had disappeared. Engine 2 was now running at nearly 80% capacity. The electrical system warnings had cleared. You did it, Harrington said, his voice filled with genuine amazement. Amara was already reaching for the radio. Atlanta Center, Atlantic 2187. We have recovered primary systems and Engine 2 is stabilized. We still need to divert to Nashville. Roger that, Atlantic 2187. Descend and maintain flight level 240. Nashville approach has been notified of your emergency. As they began their descent, navigating carefully around the edges of the storm system, Harrington turned to Amara. That procedure isn't in any manual I've ever read. It was developed after a series of similar incidents, she explained, still focused on the instruments. I took that advanced electrical systems course last year. It's not standard training yet, but it's been considered after incidents like these started appearing with the newer electrical systems. For the first time since they'd met that morning, Harrington looked at Amara, really looked at her, seeing not just a young black woman who had invaded his cockpit, but a highly trained pilot whose knowledge had just saved the aircraft and everyone on board. I need you to talk me through the emergency landing procedure you're planning, he said, his tone now respectful, collaborative. This is your show now. Amara nodded, already calculating fuel dumps, approach angles, and emergency protocols for Nashville. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cockpit, the atmosphere had completely transformed. As she began outlining the approach procedure, Harrington listened with full attention, all traces of his earlier condescension gone. I'll handle the passenger announcement, he said when she finished. They should know that their lives were just saved by the best co-pilot I've ever flown with. The runway lights of Nashville International Airport glowed like a beacon through the remnants of the storm as Atlantic Flight 2187 made its final approach. In the cabin, passengers sat in tense silence, gripping armrests and saying silent prayers. Flight attendants moved through the cabin one last time, checking seatbelts and preparing for landing. In the cockpit, Amara guided the aircraft down with steady hands, compensating for the still recovering Engine 2. Harrington handled communications with the tower, confirming that emergency vehicles were standing by, though they now believed they could manage a normal landing. Flaps 30. Amara called out, her focus absolute as the ground came up to meet them. Flaps 30, Harrington confirmed, executing her command without hesitation, a complete reversal of their earlier dynamic. The wheels touched down with a squeal and a bump, firmer than usual but perfectly safe given the circumstances. As the plane slowed on the runway, spontaneous applause erupted from the cabin, passengers releasing their tension through grateful cheers and even a few tears. Nice landing, Harrington said quietly as they taxied toward the gate, emergency vehicles escorting them as a precaution. Once they were safely parked and the engines shut down, the cabin crew began the disembarkation process. The cockpit door opened and Rosa appeared, her face showing the strain of the emergency but also immense relief. Passengers are all okay, she reported. A few minor injuries from the turbulence, but the medical team is already helping them. As the last passenger left the aircraft, Harrington and Amara remained in the cockpit, completing their final paperwork and incident reports. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving them both drained but intensely aware of what they'd just lived through. Harrington set down his pen and turned to Amara, his expression more open than she'd seen all day. "You saved us up there," he said simply, his voice humbled. "I've been flying for over 20 years, and I've never seen anyone handle that situation so effectively." Amara nodded, accepting his words without false modesty. "Thank you, Captain." "James," he corrected her. "After what we just went through, I think we can use first names." A small smile crossed her face. "All right, James." Later that evening, after hours of debriefing with airline officials and safety investigators, they sat in the hotel restaurant, two exhausted pilots sharing a quiet meal. The initial report had already concluded that Amara's quick thinking and specialized training had prevented what could have been a catastrophic incident. "I owe you an apology," Harrington said, looking directly at Amara across the table. "The way I treated you this morning was unprofessional and unfair." "It wasn't the first time I've experienced that kind of reception," Amara replied evenly. "Probably won't be the last." Harrington nodded, his expression thoughtful. "When I started flying in the 90s, I could count the number of female pilots I knew on one hand, let alone black female pilots. I told myself the industry was changing, that I was changing with it." He shook his head. "Today showed me I still had assumptions I wasn't even aware of." "Recognizing that is the first step," Amara said. "What matters now is what you do next." 6 months later, at Atlantic Airlines Training Center, a classroom of new pilots listened attentively as Captain James Harrington shared the story of Flight 2187. The incident had become a case study in both electrical system failures and human factors in aviation. "The technical lessons from that day saved us," Harrington told the class, which included 4 women and several people of color. "But the human lesson was just as important. I let my biases cloud my judgment of a highly qualified pilot, and it nearly cost us everything." In the back of the room, Amara Washington, recently promoted to captain, listened with quiet satisfaction. The incident report she'd filed had led to changes in training protocols and new emergency procedures being adopted across the airline. After the session, a young black woman approached her, eyes bright with ambition. "Captain Washington, your story is the reason I applied to flight school. I never thought someone like me could make it in this industry." Amara smiled, remembering how few role models she'd had when starting her own journey. "The sky belongs to all of us," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As she watched the next generation of pilots file out of the classroom, Amara reflected on how a single flight had changed so many trajectories, not just her own career, but the culture of an entire airline, and now the dreams of young pilots who would no longer see the cockpit as a place where they didn't belong.